talking to you more about that at some point.
Absolutely. I look forward to it as well.
Yeah, so, and it's going to be in the fall issue.
Yeah. With your
For those
permission.
of you on social media, we just popped online. We're talking with Jeremy Baker here tonight. We're going to get our music started and let everybody into the room. Thank you for being here.
Hey, good evening. Good evening and welcome. It's good to see so many of you back. There's some faces that I'm familiar with, a few faces I haven't seen for a while. My name is Todd DiPastino. This is the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we get together every Monday night at 7 p.m. to have conversations with veterans. And we've been doing, the Veterans Breakfast Club has been around for 17 years. We've been doing veteran storytelling events, programs for 17 years. And somebody said to me the other day, something like this: "Oh, it's nice what you do for veterans." And I thought, oh man, she doesn't get it. I'm not that altruistic. This is for me. Like, I love these conversations. These conversations are just, they keep me going, they fascinate me. And tonight is certainly going to be one of those. We have Jeremy Baker, who is an Army counterintelligence agent who served in Afghanistan, and he's a wonderfully gifted writer. We have another gifted writer, Daria Summers, who is our managing editor of BBC Magazine. Thank you, Daria, for bringing Jeremy to this program. And I know we're going to be publishing another one of Jeremy's pieces later in BBC Magazine. But I thought I'd throw it to you, Daria, to introduce Jeremy and tonight's subject.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm so glad, Jeremy, that your publicist thought to reach out, because as soon as I sort of read about you and got a copy of your book, I was just like, well, we have to have him on. For everyone joining us, Jeremy is a former counter Army intelligence agent and combat veteran. In 2002, as part of the 202nd Military Intelligence Battalion, Jeremy went to Afghanistan, where he was assigned to the 19th Special Forces Green Berets, many of whom had also served in Vietnam. So, which is like, I had never heard of anything like that before. But after returning home, Jeremy suffered from PTSD and turned to writing to help him heal. In May, his novel, The Guilty Sleep, a thriller that draws on his experiences overcoming PTSD, was released by Diversion Books. Lee Child described it as being shot through with hard-won authenticity and deep humanity. And United States Marine Corps veteran and novelist Elliot Ackerman praised it as cutting sharp and deep. Having read it myself, I'll add that in my humble opinion, Jeremy does a really amazing job of balancing the humanity of his subjects, of his characters really, with intense action sequences that deliver phenomenal plot twists. One that kept me up until like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. So with that, I'll just want to say welcome, Jeremy. We're so glad you could join us. And hello to everyone again. And I thought, just to kickstart this conversation, one of the things that caught my attention about your biography was how you went from college dropout, you went to join the Army, and then you just totally aced the Army entrance exams, I'll call them. And they gave you your choice, and you picked counterintelligence because you thought it sounded cool. Can you just like talk about like that journey from college dropout to counterintelligence agent? And I just want to say that for context, this was all just before, really a year before 9/11. I think we have to
Ask you to unmute. Yep.
Yeah.
Ask you to unmute, Jeremy. There you go.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. Daria, thanks for that introduction. Todd, thanks as well for having me on. Yeah, that was a little bit of a journey there at the start of my military career. I I'd been a relatively good student, but I was one of many young people for whom maybe college right after high school isn't the best fit. And so my first foray into college didn't go very well. And I dropped out. And I had always been interested in sort of law enforcement work and trying to help folks. And I had actually applied for a local police department, which is how I ended up joining the Army, because I did really well in the police department's entrance exams there in Fairfax County, Virginia. But I was, I don't know, something like the 25th or 26th highest ranked applicant out of, over 400, and there was 10 positions they were going to fill. And the recruiting captain said, listen, one of the best things you can do, since you don't have any college to speak of, is join the military. And I said, anything in particular? He said, yeah, just join the military, do a tour, and then apply again. In fairness, the Army entrance exam is basically, if you don't eat the pencil, if you use it to take the test instead of using it for a snack, they tend to give you pretty high marks. The recruiter, and this was in 2000, right? So it was still like, he just gave me the big book of military occupational specialties, said, flip through this till you find something that appeals to you. And counterintelligence agent, when I saw that, it was the first thing that really jumped out to me as I was paging through. And I thought, yeah, that sounds really cool. That sounds really interesting. And it sounds like I could learn the sorts of things that might help me become a police officer someday, was my thought process. And you're right, I enlisted in April of 2000. And I was actually, I completed my basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, Charlie 148 Infantry, hooah. And then I did my advanced individual training for counterintelligence special agent with the U.S. Army at Fort Huachuca, which is in southern Arizona, and is absolutely just a beautiful place to be and to train and learn. And I did that for 6 months. And so I was, about 6 months into my first assignment when 9/11 happened. And everything that sort of cascaded from there. So that was essentially my journey from college dropout to the Army.
So I just want to follow that up because, I mean, I'm sure everyone has a story, but I was in New York when 9/11 happened. I wasn't that far from the World Trade Towers. And it just had this, like, more than anything I'd ever experienced. Like, I'm like, the world has changed. This is not good. Even 2 weeks from that, like, so it just made me think, for you, just entering service, and there was, many people who went in prior to 9/11, just, we'd been a peacetime, more or less, Army, not, I mean, there was the Gulf War, but nothing like that was 20 years of war. So I was just wondering, what was that like for you? When that happened, were you like, holy shit, I mean, or excuse me, holy, my goodness, what's gonna happen now? Did you have that feeling, or was it gradual?
Yeah. So a couple things. First of all, so as far as I'm concerned, I mean, it's not my meeting, Daria, it's yours and Todd's, but this is a safe space for all language as far as I'm concerned. Right. So let fly. And second, in the chat, Todd, you nailed it in one. That is indeed how you spell Huachuca. Absolutely brilliant. Yes. But no, you're right. Like, so Daria, I'm by no means a historian, but I'm greatly interested in history, and have read a lot of history, and have talked to a lot of people who have lived through history, as I'm sure many of the folks in this meeting have, right? And there are certain things that happen. It seems like every generation has its sort of earth-shattering moment, right? My mother-in-law talks about the day when Kennedy was assassinated, for example. My grandparents would talk about the Great Depression or Pearl Harbor. For the longest time, I thought, for my generation, sort of Gen X, born right around 1980, it was the Challenger disaster, which many of us saw unfold live on television in school. But certainly 9/11 was another one of those moments, I believe, in the sort of fabric and psyche of our nation that shapes who we are as a society and as a people, based on, its sort of trauma to our national psyche and our response to it. And like you said, like, in those events, right, you look back years later and everyone can remember where they were, what they were doing, who they were with, and sort of, maybe what happened next. For me, I joined the Army, in 2000. And so it was about a year and a half later. I was about 6 or 8 months into my first real assignment at the 202nd MI Battalion in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And I was actually on my first deployment as a young counterintelligence agent. I was a private first class E3 at the time at our field office in Kuwait. So I was in Camp Doha, Kuwait, a couple dozen miles south of the Iraq border. And it was afternoon. And we were actually getting ready to take a ride on a Black Hawk helicopter, and we were going to go up to the Iraq border. Me and some other members of the counterintelligence team that I was assigned to there in Kuwait. And all the first indication we had that something was wrong was that our flight had been grounded and canceled, and that we needed to return to the office immediately. And we got back to the office, and it was just as the second plane hit the other tower. And that's when we knew, right, that something terrible had happened. And that for those of us who were in the military, right, it was very obvious that we were under attack, that something happened. There was great confusion immediately. We didn't know right away who was behind it. But we knew that we had been attacked, and we knew that for us, everything had changed. And you're right. I joined the Army in a time where, with the exception of some relatively small scale operations, Panama, Haiti, things like that, it was largely very much a peacetime military. And of course, we were over a generation removed from having a draft, right? We're all volunteer force. The last major engagement of the U.S. military was, Desert Storm, a decade before. So for most of us, especially those of us who are on our first enlistments, like I was, it was, very clearly the start of a new world. And very sort of, especially in that first 24, 48 hours, very sort of shifting sands under our feet. Right. And not knowing who was going on, what was going on, who was responsible, if there was a foreign nation that was behind this in some way, or if it was, what it ended up being, sort of a terrorist group. So yeah, it was quite a time of uncertainty and fear, but also understanding of, okay, we've been attacked and we're going to have a job to do. And this is what we have trained for. And this is why the U.S. government spent the time and the energy and the money, teaching us the skills that they taught us, so that we can go find the people who are responsible for this and bring them to justice, whether that's, bracelets on wrists or warheads on foreheads.
Wow. So yeah. I didn't know that part of the story. You were already basically in the neighborhood of what. So take us from, if you can, and this is where I'm sure it gets really interesting, from that moment to 2002 when you arrived in Afghanistan with, and were you were attached to the 19th what was it, the 19th, the
19 Special Forces.
The 19th Special Forces. So you were attached to them, but just talk us through that, because I also wanted to know about, like, if you were part of the 202nd Military Intelligence Battalion, but they sent you get attached to that Special Forces group, and then you go over together, or just take us through that.
So yeah, I mean, it was a whirlwind few months from being in Kuwait. I was due to rotate home from Kuwait in that September timeframe. We were almost at the end of our tour. We extended a little bit to keep running. We were doing what they call a force protection mission in Kuwait, right? Looking for threats against U.S. forces. And all of a sudden we had, this huge threat, after the 9/11 attacks. So we had a lot of work to do there. And I had a couple of battle buddies, associates, U.S. Army fellow soldiers there in Kuwait with me at the time, who I think it was within, sort of 30 days or so, we had a good sense that al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks and that they were being sheltered and supported by the Taliban government of Afghanistan, right? Quasi-government. And so I had friends and associates there who were in Kuwait with me who like spoke Arabic, for example, because they had been trained as a linguist by the military, and their military specialty was interrogation, right? So like some of them went over immediately in late 2001 and that very first wave, because of their language skills. I rotated back with some of my other fellow soldiers back to my home unit, the 202nd MI Battalion in Fort Gordon, where we started training up for deployment to Afghanistan. The 202nd MI Battalion, while assigned to Fort Gordon, Georgia, its geographic area of responsibility around the world was the Middle East and North Africa. So it was a unit that was designated, if something happened at that area, that's where we would deploy to. So we knew right from the get-go that if there is a need for large-scale military intelligence presence in Afghanistan, we're first up, right? And we were trained to operate in smaller groups broken away from our home units, supporting infantry units, or special forces units, or military police, or ranger units, things like that, because it's not really effective to drop a whole battalion of counterintelligence folks just together in one place, right? That's not how the counterintelligence discipline works. You need to be assigned to operators. You need to support the sharp end of the spear, so to speak, by being close to them. And so I was not actually initially slated to deploy to Afghanistan. So I was a couple weeks behind our little team that went. But one of the guys there, almost immediately upon landing, contracted amoebic dysentery and had to return, get medevaced to the States. Afghanistan is just not good for your health in general, right? It's not a healthy environment. And so I was sort of next up in the rotation. I had a couple of sort of advanced training courses and things that they thought would be valuable. So they shipped me out a couple weeks later. So I actually arrived by myself in Afghanistan, and then joined the rest of my very small counterintelligence team. There's about 6 of us, and the 6 of us were assigned to a couple of teams from the 19th Special Forces Group, which again, U.S. Army Green Berets. And this was a double-sized team. So your typical Special Forces team is I'm not an expert, roughly a dozen folks. This was an A and a B team. So we had about 24, 25 Special Forces guys. And this was actually, whoever came up with this concept, it was really, really a genius idea, and I'm sure somebody got promoted ahead of schedule for it, is you take a team of Special Forces guys, very, very seasoned, competent military operators, and then you add a counterintelligence team like I was a part of, you add a civil affairs team and a psychological operations team to that Special Forces construct. And then what happens is the counterintelligence team and the intelligence elements of the Special Forces team work together to go gather information about the bad guys, who they are, where they are, what they're up to, where their weapons caches, what are the imminent threats, right? You gather that intelligence, you come back, you prepare an operation. The Special Forces guys, they go out and hit the target, right? Generally with great success. And then what happens is the civil affairs team comes in behind, and we're here on behalf of the U.S. government and the U.S. Army to build you a well and to build a neighborhood school in this area where the bad guys were operating, right? And then they go and do that. And then the following week, the psychological operations folks come in and they distribute leaflets for those that can read, or they play pre-recorded messages, right, in the local languages, Pashtun, Urdu, Dari, and basically say, the U.S. government came and they built this well, they built this school, and we were able to do that because, we got rid of the bad guys who were in the area. So please, if they come back, let us know, and then we can come help you out some more. So it created this cycle of, we were getting lots of good information from the locals about the things we wanted to know. Where are those bad guys, and what are they up to, and where can we find them, and then the special forces guys would go hit the target, and it would just, I called it the cycle of kinetic operations. And for a young soldier who was keenly interested in avenging 9/11 and doing good work and learning, it was a very sort of heady experience. I was an E4 at the time, now a specialist, and here I am in civilian clothes with a beard, and I'm running around with, as you mentioned, guys who had served at the tail end of Vietnam. And what I didn't know until I actually got to Afghanistan was that the 19th Special Forces Group, and even as a soldier at the time, I did not realize this was a possibility. The 19th Special Forces Group was a reserve unit. The U.S. Army has reserve Special Forces soldiers. So these were guys who had 35 years of service, some of them in the U.S. Army, not all of it active duty. A lot of them were firefighters and police officers and mountaineers and park rangers and things like that. But you knew that these were serious men who knew their business. And they were almost all older. Even if they hadn't served in Vietnam, some of them had been through Operation Just Cause and certainly Desert Storm, and had long, interesting periods of service, and just an opportunity to work with and learn from those guys and to see how they operated. I've never seen such a group of people that was so just unflappable about anything that would happen, whether we were, someone was trying to launch rockets at the little building that we lived in the middle of downtown Kandahar in southeast Afghanistan. I forgot to mention, we weren't at the base behind the wire. We were living in the middle of the city, in sort of a little compound. These guys weren't bothered by anything. And so even though there was maybe 50 Americans surrounded by a town of 2 million people, and we weren't sure who wanted to kill us, most of the time I felt pretty safe because of those guys. And I'm always very careful to say, right, when I talk about this, in case I haven't made it clear already, I was not in the special forces, right? I was an intel weenie assigned to support those real guys.
Wow. I just want to say that makes me think of, and I know it's not exactly like it or anything, but just I was a big fan of Homeland when it was on, and there were
Sure.
just scenes and probably this is more in Pakistan where they were, but just like, you just see those guys, they're not in uniform, they're just in their trucks driving around, and they just appear and can do anything and then disappear.
Yeah.
Can you, and I want to open it up, I'm sure people have questions, and I'm very curious to ask more about the Green Berets who had also been Vietnam vets, but I think it would just be fun before we do that, just so we can really understand, if it's possible, can you take us through a mission, like a narrative, like, in other words, for you, what was your encounter? I really want to know, what did you have to go out and do?
Sure.
Because like you explained the level, you go out and you find where the bad guys are. How do you tell who the bad guys are? Like what? And then you come back and then you find, okay, they need to go out and take down this, these weapons, and then, like, that was a really great explanation, but like, break it down.
Sure. So what the Army trains you to do as a counterintelligence agent, right? Counterintelligence is just a fancy way of saying spy catching. So the Army trains you to be a counterintelligence agent, which means they train you to identify and investigate and stop espionage threats or spy threats to the U.S. Army, right? So Army counterintelligence does for the U.S. Army what the CIA does for the federal government writ large. That's what you're trained to do. But as part of that training, you also learn like investigative techniques. You also learn how to debrief a source of information, how to interrogate a captured enemy combatant, things like that. So a lot of the work associated with counterintelligence in the Army is developing relationships with sources of information, either willing or unwilling, right? If as those sources may be, and using those relationships to extract information that will help keep you and your fellow soldiers safe, especially when you're in a combat environment. So in Afghanistan, our job was very simple, which was gather intelligence about the enemy, so that the enemy, one, can't kill me and my friends, and two, so that we can try to find Osama bin Laden and the Taliban leadership, and sort of bring them to justice, right? So that's kind of the overarching mission. How we sliced it and diced it in Kandahar in Southeast Afghanistan, which was sort of the historic stronghold of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, was we divided ourselves as a team of 5 counterintelligence agents. We split up. And so one of us would pair with a couple of special forces soldiers on intelligence gathering missions. So I paired with a guy and his partner, who were both very senior special forces guys, and experienced, and they were a couple of the intelligence sergeants on the special forces team. So these were guys who were not only special forces soldiers, but had a lot of intelligence training as well. And I went out with them, and we would meet with a series of sources, you might call them. Now, a source could be an Afghan government official who wants to share information with the US government. It could be a local shopkeeper who has good relationships in the neighborhood and knows what's going on where he lives and with his customers. It could be someone from the local Afghan government, maybe in one of the utility services, like the electric service or the sewage service or something, right? Who's plugged into the sort of local environment, and knows what's going on. It could be someone from the Afghan military or police, or it could be, and this is one of the truths of intelligence and counterintelligence work, is some of the best sources are absolute scumbags. They're drug lords or criminals, and they know very well what's going on. Now, the challenge, especially in a place like Afghanistan, is that there are people who will use the U.S. military to settle old scores, right? The culture of Afghanistan, if you've been there, if you've researched it, it's very, very complex. It's less a coherent, cohesive nation than it is a geographic collection of tribes and subtribes and clans and families and cultures and various ethnic groups. And they all have their own relationships with each other. And so one of our big challenges was, here's someone telling me and my SF partners, as we're meeting with them, one of our good sources, hey, this guy over here is Taliban, and he's got all kinds of weapons buried in his backyard, right? That might absolutely be true, or that might be someone whose grandfather insulted somebody else's grandfather, and there's been a blood feud ever since, and this is an opportunity to settle a score. So you couldn't just mindlessly take information and just go act on it, right? There's a certain amount. You've got to have a relationship with the source and know that they're trustworthy, or as trustworthy as they can be, right? Based on a history of work with that person. And you got to try to verify that information that they give you through maybe another source or surveillance or satellite imagery or something like that. So it was a very, very complex and complicated environment, especially for a young soldier on his first enlistment, who was very much learning the job as he went. And so it really was sort of the most impactful assignment of my national security career, if you will, was that assignment and doing that work. So your average day, you might go out and meet with 1, 2, 3, or 4 of your sources, or you might try to identify and cultivate a new potential source. And any one of those activities, you'll sit down and talk with one of those sources, gather some information if you can, come back, you write up a report, you sort of help the SF guys, the special forces guys, plan what they might do about that information. And you're just constantly, it's really just all information flow when it comes down to it. You're just constantly gathering information, meeting and talking to people, and then trying to judge whether the information is accurate. And then if anybody does anything on the information, you're trying to judge what happened afterwards to see if you had an impact. So I don't know if that, hopefully that answers your question.
No, it does. And I mean, it also sounds a little bit like the fact that, I mean, I'm sure it was a double-edged sword, but the fact that Afghanistan was all these tribal fiefdoms and warring, drug lords, et cetera, was at times beneficial because there wasn't a solidified group that was loyal to the country that, but anyway, I just wanted to open it up in case there's some questions in the chat or if anybody has a question. Sean?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say it had to have been confusing or almost overwhelming. I come down to my basement and I'm overwhelmed organizing it, but you walk into a country and have to like suss out who is who and who knows who, and how did you organize that with your team like when you first got there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so complex and it's so tricky. And I mean, how long did we fight there? Right? We were there longer than any war I think we've ever fought as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at what happened as soon as we left. Just before this meeting, right, chatting with Todd about the latest great issue of the magazine and the fall of Saigon and the parallels to the fall of Kabul. So I don't know that we really. I think in pockets, Sean. I think in pockets we figured that out. In Kandahar, at the time I was there, by the time I left, sort of in the back half of 2002, we had a pretty good sense of, okay, if you go talk to someone from this family, they really, really have heartburn with this other family over here. And so anything they tell you about that family, like you got to look at with a grain of salt. But that family over there also has very deep ties to al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and all these other like nefarious actors. And so the information could very well be accurate. But I think there were certain pockets in the US government that had developed a deep understanding of Afghan culture and relationship. But that knowledge was not spread throughout, I think, the warfighting community as deeply as it could have been. And I think that's one of the things that maybe hindered our progress. But I think in a situation that complex, one person almost has to be in it for so long that you just can't do that when you're rotating folks through in 6 months or even 1 year increments. It takes sometimes a lifetime of study to understand a system sort of that complex and so foreign to sort of the American ideals of what democracy is and could be, for example, or what a functioning government looks like. And what civil service looks like absent corruption and bribes and grift and graft and things like that. It's all. I heard someone say one time, this actually made it into the book, you needed 100,000 teachers, professors, lawyers, and doctors and librarians, and not 100,000 total, like 100,000 of each, to be there for 20 or 30 years if you were going to try to institute a American style Western liberal democracy, because of just how complex and different the environment was there.
And a quick follow-up, the nefarious actors that you were talking about, how hard was it to distinguish between those groups as you were going on operations and talking with people?
You mean like distinguishing one group from another bad group?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, generally you kind of had a sense of who people were. Like, so for example, if they were involved in terrorism, but they were also involved in opium smuggling, it was probably a group called the Haqqani Network, or HQN, which has been around for a long time. I think all the way back to the Afghan Soviet invasion. And this is a group, if you follow South American politics at all, you might almost liken to some of the Colombian communist groups like the FARC, where they had an ideology that they used narcotics trafficking to fund their actions in service of that ideology. So the FARC was also a terrorist group, but also a drug trafficking organization. That was like the Haqqani network. Then you had your hardcore al-Qaeda, and usually you could tell al-Qaeda because those were the guys who were mostly not Afghans, right? So remember, al-Qaeda was led by Osama bin Laden, who was a Saudi, and it had a lot of adherents from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, and then from some of the Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and some of the Russian Caucasus area like Dagestan and Chechnya, right? So Afghans, even though it was a lot of different cultures and ethnic groups making up Afghanistan, they would also all go, hey, that guy's not from here. So if it was a foreign fighter, you almost always knew they were al-Qaeda. But if they were a quote unquote bad guy who was an Afghan, chances were they were the Taliban, because that was the sort of, the quasi government that was supporting al-Qaeda. So like you start doing the work and you kind of learned, okay, the way they're talking about this guy makes me think, okay, he's going to end up being al-Qaeda. And sometimes the source would even tell you, right? Like this guy was Taliban. Well, how do you know? Well, when the Taliban was in power, he was the director of public works here in Kandahar, and you could only get that job if you were a member of the Taliban party and like supported their organization, that sort of thing.
Interesting. Thanks.
So I want to ask, because I know there were women in Afghanistan, and were they at that time, like, I'm assuming they were in fully covered, and you probably had no interaction with them, or did they come to you? What was that like?
Yeah, that's right. So under the Taliban, right, it was the very strictest interpretation of sort of Islamic cultural laws and norms, which was women were to be very covered. And so in some places that I served, like in Kuwait, for example, which was a more liberal Islamic oriented country, women would still almost always wear a head covering, a scarf, but you could see their face. Or out in public in a shopping mall, for example, the younger Kuwaiti women might have their heads completely uncovered. In Afghanistan, under the Taliban, women were required to be completely covered head to foot, and they wore something called a burqa, which was the most restrictive covering, which was essentially a full hood from top of the head to the soles of the feet, and you couldn't even see the face. There was a woven screen where the face would be, that looked almost like a fabric fencing mask. So on my team, and actually in the compound where we lived, on the U.S. side, there were no women at all, because we were not, at that time in 2002, women were by and large not coming forward and talking to the U.S. military. And you wouldn't see women uncovered out and about in the streets. And I think it was later on, right, the Afghan government, as they keep in mind, right, in 2002, there was no real Afghan government to speak of. That we were like, you've ousted the Taliban, but there's no functioning Afghan government really being built up yet. So later on in the U.S. military involvement there, you started to see more of a prevalence of Afghan female service members, right, who are being trained in the Afghan police services or military, who could talk to women and things like that. But by and large, the way we were situated early days there was they wouldn't send a woman to the Southeast to work in the U.S. military, although we did have a team up in the capital in Bagram that had a number of female soldiers on it who did great work. Bagram being the capital where we were installing the new government. And there was a lot of good work to be done there, but especially in Kandahar, which was a very sort of culturally regressive area anyways, to the point where one of the best things about working with all of these more senior special forces veterans is a lot of them had gray in their beards. And in the Afghan culture, that meant they were an elder and they were automatically to be respected and trusted. So as a young 20-something going out with these guys who were in their 40s or older with the gray in their beards, it opened doors for us. Senior Afghans would be much more likely to talk to us and share information with us because of that perception of seniority.
Did you know that? Culturally, had people been educated, soldiers been educated on that going in, or was just something that you discovered in the interactions?
I personally was educated on it before I went a little bit, right? There was piecemeal of, hey, you're going to deploy, stop shaving immediately, right? And hey, you're going to the Southeast, there's no women on the team. You're not going to be cultivating any female sources. The operational environment's too difficult for that, so don't try to do that. And we sat through some classes on Afghan culture, and I'll kind of harken back to my original sort of what I was saying about that is the deep knowledge of Afghan culture was not spread wide among especially the lower ranks in those early days. We got hey, 2 or 3 hours of indoctrination on this is the kind of culture that you can expect. This is the sort of environment you can expect. This is how you should carry yourself, and things like that.
Are there any questions coming through the chat? Or
Yes, and I will invite people
Okay.
to raise their hands like this, wave it in front of the camera, or raise their electronic hands. I certainly have a question. Al Smith, I'm sorry. Al Smith, Al, there you are. Good question.
Yeah, I maybe like a 2 or 3 part question. When you got there, what was the morale of the troops? Did people feel like we should be there for? And when we did pull out, was it very disappointing to you that you left some Afghan friends behind?
Yeah, Al, thanks so much for the question. I'm glad you asked it. So when I was there, arrived early in 2002, right? Gosh, I can't believe it's been so long already. Yeah, morale was high. Morale was, excuse my rough language, we just got done kicking the Taliban's ass out of power, right? The US government with some special forces guys dropped into the north of the country, teaming with the Northern Alliance, and some precision airstrikes, and a couple of companies of Rangers essentially routed the entire Taliban government and sent them on the run. And now we're on the ground, kind of in the second wave, and we're here to find the bastards that did this to us. So morale was extremely high in those early days, and we were running and gunning, finding bad guys, taking them off the board, and we had a clear mission and a clear idea of why we were there. We were there to bring justice to those who had perpetrated the crime of 9/11 on the American people. Then 20 years later, as we pull out, yeah, that was Al, that was a hard time for me emotionally, for a couple of reasons. So when I was in Afghanistan, I was and I was not fluent in any of the languages of Afghanistan, and the vast majority of my team was not as well. So we relied on interpreters, many of whom were U.S. citizens who had left Afghanistan at some point in the past and made it to the U.S. and pursued legal immigration, chasing the American dream, and had reached safety, right? Many of them fled Afghanistan because of either the Soviet occupation and wars of the 80s, or the descent into sort of Islamic fundamentalist theocracy, right? They fled Afghanistan, they came to the States, they made it, they were safe. And they said, you know what? My new adopted country needs me. And I'm going to help my country by going back to the place that I or my family fled from and doing what only I can do, or what a limited group of me and my friends can do, which is speak the languages and help my country. Right. So that speaks very powerfully to me. And as someone who's like a 4th generation American, like I can't fully grasp or understand that mindset or sacrifice and what it took for those people to do that. And the 4 interpreters that I worked with all fit that bill. They were all either a lawful permanent U.S. resident, or they were a U.S. citizen who volunteered, right, who took a job to go back. And we also worked with a number of Afghans when I was there, who I think of as absolute heroes, because they had suffered under the Taliban occupation and had dreamed of a free Afghanistan, a democratic Afghanistan, a land of peace and end to the bloodshed. And they put themselves in very real danger to help us. The locals that that helped us, or even the interpreters who were from the US but still had family in Afghanistan, all of them put themselves and their families at tremendous risk to help us. And so when we pulled out, the US government made a concerted effort called Operation Allies Welcome / Allies Refuge, which was designed to bring Afghans who had helped Americans in Afghanistan, bring them to the States and get them legal status. It was not a perfect process by any means. And I am haunted, and I know a number of other veterans, many veterans who served there are haunted by the prospect that we left people behind who may have been killed, or their families killed, or have been victimized in some way because they were not able to get out in time. That's haunting. And all of that kind of went into the book, Al, as I was writing it, because I started writing this book after the fall of Afghanistan, about 2 months after the fall of Afghanistan. I was just having so many thoughts and feelings about it. And I was talking to a lot of other vets who were having thoughts and feelings about it. And the two common themes were concern for the people who had helped us. That was always first and foremost on everyone's mind. And then the other thing was, and I wonder if this will resonate maybe with some of the Vietnam vets, is we were there for so long and so many people were lost on our side and theirs, and civilians, and we're leaving, and the same people that we were fighting in the beginning are now going to be in charge. What the hell was it all for? Right. And so those were a lot of the feelings and thoughts and emotions that I was thinking and feeling, and that some of my fellow veterans were thinking and feeling. And there's a scene in the book of a veteran support group sitting down together to talk in the basement of a church. And as I wrote this group, it's funny, I look at sort of the mission statement or the core values of Veterans Breakfast Club, which is every veteran has a story and there's power in storytelling. And this group in the book gets together to talk about their stories and share their stories and kind of heal. And there's a conversation that plays out in the book in this veterans group that basically encapsulates all of the things that I was talking about with my fellow veterans over the course of the months after the fall of Afghanistan. So Al, I hope that answers your question, but yeah, it was a very deep and emotional sort of issue for me, going back to that time period. Yes.
Sorry, you go, Todd.
Okay, I was just going to say, I do have a follow-up question. Steve Corbett, I think that Jeremy just answered the question that you put here in the chat. I do, before I ask my follow-up and go to you, or you go to me, Daria, I'm going to ask Rich Kensinger. Do you have a question for Jeremy?
I do. Jeremy, I'm a clinical psychologist. I did serve in the military as an ER medic. I do extensive research on combat trauma. That's even dating back to World War II. I have talked to, I don't interview them, I talk to them about how much they felt betrayed and resentful. And I think you're a classic example. So how do you come out of the service knowing that the country let so many people down? It's like Vietnam. We knew we couldn't win it. So I'm just, I appreciate you talking about that, because it's one of my clinical specialties, combat trauma. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done, and thank you for listening to people talk about their trauma. That's certainly something that I dealt with after my deployment. And I think one of the reasons why I felt so deeply during the U.S. withdrawal was because I had struggled with PTSD after my combat deployment. And to your point, and to Steve's question, do you feel your efforts were wasted? And in my more glib moments, I would try to laugh it off and say something like, well, when I left, we were winning. And I will say, right, I think there was one of these questions, I think in the chat, part of Al Smith's question, In 2002, we had a very clear sense of why we were there and what we were doing. And, I tend to stay pretty apolitical in these things. So everything is just my opinion. Is we had a very clear mission. Go in and get the sons of bitches who did this to us and bring them to justice. Now, I am not a geopolitical expert. I'm a college dropout. I am not a diplomat. I'm not a historian. I'm not a government expert. But I think the minute you try to install a Western liberal style big D democracy in a place that's never known anything like it, and you try to make it look just like America as much as you can, and you try to pick out American analogs for bodies of government and things like that, where there's just no concept of how that can work in a place, and you decide you're going to engage in nation building, you are signing up to flush trillions of dollars and gallons of blood right down the toilet. So yeah, I got a lot of feelings about that. Yeah. And so I never felt like I had been lied to by my political leaders, because again, in 2002, we knew who had done it to us, and we were going to go get them. And I was glad we were there. Now, don't ask me how I felt about the war in Iraq. That came a couple years later. Even as a college dropout and sitting U.S. service member, I found myself going, "Why are we going into Iraq now?" But again, that's neither here nor there for the story. But yeah, that feeling of what was it all for? That's what kept resonating over and over again. That sounds exactly like what you're saying, the conversations that you've heard. Yeah.
Okay, Jeremy. I'm sorry, Daria. I'm just so curious about this. You described so well, Jeremy, that in 2002, you're in Afghanistan, and you described being in a position of moral clarity, that the mission was clear, the justification was clear, that who the perpetrators were clear to you in your mind. Where did that clarity start shading into ambiguity? Because it does seem to be that one of the damaging things that war does, and I think it does it to everybody to some degree, is it introduces this kind of moral compromises, moral ambiguity. You mentioned working with some pretty nefarious characters, and having to work closely with them, even though you know that they're doing bad in the world, but you still have to treat them as allies. When did the kind of moral clarity start shade into ambiguity for you, and what impact did that have on you?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's multi-layered, right, Todd? Like, there's the moral ambiguity of like, hey, I've got to go talk to one of my prime sources of information, who I am reasonably sure, but I don't have confirmation, is probably a pedophile.
Yeah.
But I know he can tell me
Yeah.
where the Haqqani network cell is that is planning to ambush my British Special Air Service colleagues next week. And so I got to go, and this is all, we'll just say this is hypothetical for the sake of the conversation, but I've got to go have a reasonable and friendly conversation with that person so that I can save my British mates, right? Or try to. So there's a certain amount of moral ambiguity as a counterintelligence agent and intelligence collector that you have to be comfortable with, or not comfortable with, that you have to accept. And I was someone who was raised in a very traditional religious American upbringing, and taught the 10 Commandments and taught right and wrong. And now I'm having to deal with some of the worst people in the world to get even worse people, right? And that's something that you kind of have to accept in the moment for the exigencies of the mission, while at the same time in the back of your mind going, okay, he might be a great source, but I'm never going to recommend him for a special immigrant visa to the US at the end of our service, because I don't want him in America. But this person over here who is giving me information out of a sense of duty, and because they want a better life for their family and they want safety and security, yeah, I will try to do everything I can to help that person, right? So there's that sort of personal, very, very personal moral ambiguity that you deal with when you're doing intelligence work, right? And you're chasing bad guys when you're cultivating sources like that. And then there's the sort of broader scale, what you might call mission ambiguity, how you get from a mission of bringing bad guys to justice to, well, we think we ought to try to reconstruct this country and build it up and make it something. And look, like I said, I am not an expert, but I wonder if, you know, the US government was looking backwards to the end of World War II and seeing what we did in post World War II Germany, for example, where we were, you know, over the course of many decades of billions of dollars of investment, you know, in Germany and Japan and other places where our most dangerous foes became some of our strongest allies. I wonder if someone somewhere hoped, hey, we'll turn Afghanistan into the Germany of Central Asia. And I think maybe, I don't know when that happened and who made those decisions or why. But I think that's where the ambiguity, once you started getting from a mission of that was very sort of tactical and kinetic in focus of going after the bad guys to, hey, what are we trying to build here nation state wise? As soon as those conversations started happening, is when I think we lost the plot as far as the mission is concerned.
Wow.
Greg Yost.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for this talk. This is absolutely terrific. I want to pick up on sort of where you were going with this, with the end of this here, and you sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, especially since you were there from the very beginning, and I think that this is a very helpful part of the story. When we're talking about something like nation building and imposing big D democracy with this structure, that was very much top down. And ironically, students of U.S. democracy, a famous book called Democracy in America, says that democracy in the United States is bottom up. It starts at the bottom and sort of works its way up. You might be familiar with the French author Alexis de Tocqueville. And so I guess my question becomes, you talked about very early on about you would go into a city, a little small village or something, and build a school, other such forms of that. How much of that do you think over the decades will take, since the US was there for so long, doing that for so long, that even though it failed from the top down, that maybe, and I don't know, maybe there was enough cultural influence to do those things that over time that will take root in Afghanistan. I don't want to get too, there are people here who've been to Vietnam and gone back, and many people say that there is such a dramatic difference between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And it's almost a controlled scientific experiment. There were certainly cultural differences between North and South before the war. But South Vietnam and North Vietnam are just not the same places now. And the clear is the strong U.S. presence there. It's an opinion. No U.S. Afghan vets will be allowed to go back to Afghanistan as tourists this decade, probably not to the 2040s, if ever. What do you think? Just opine on how much of it took.
Yeah, Greg, wow. What a question. What a philosophical direction for the conversation to go.
Leave it to Greg to bring up to Tocqueville.
Yeah, I mean, let's run the gamut here from him all the way through. And to your point about North and South Vietnam, to this day, East Germany, you know, in its years after the war of communist rule, to this day, East Germany in many cases is looked at by people in West Germany as how some Americans maybe unfortunately view like the poorest parts of Appalachia, right? It's a backwards place, it's underdeveloped, there's not enough government investment, what have you, right? And so the influence of U.S. presence, you know, has a lingering impact. Your point about Vietnam is well taken, and you look at kind of what the country's like now. All of that to say, I just don't know, Greg, about Afghanistan. Yes, we were there for a long time, but our presence, if you look at the number of troops and the size of the country, and again, I'm no geopolitical expert. I got out as a Sergeant E5, you know, again, college dropout, like I'm an autodidact on anything I've ever learned, right? So, but it seems to me that a country that size, with a culture that has so few corresponding touch points to our own, where it wasn't like we were there across the entire country for the full 20 years. You know, it's almost like where you squeeze a water balloon, you can never really pop it with your bare hands because the water just kind of squeezes out somewhere else. So you might get Kandahar province really under control and build a bunch of schools, but now all of a sudden Herat province immediately to the west is going up in flames, and we don't have enough troops in the country. So we got to take all those folks out of Kandahar and move them to Herat. And in the meantime, right, the Taliban, which has been pushed out of power, has, no kidding, a guy they call the shadow governor, which is the Taliban guy who still technically believes he's in charge of the province, who works behind the scenes and does his deals and does his meetings and maybe assumes some of the responsibility and power of the government. So you go and build that school. The year after my team is gone, how many of those schools are even still operating? So I don't think we can look at it as we were in Afghanistan for 20 years. What have we left? Because I think our presence was so inconsistent in large swaths of the country, especially outside the power centers of Bagram, Kabul, and Kandahar, that I honestly don't believe that we will. This is just my opinion. I don't believe we will see a Germany type or even a Vietnam type resurrection of Afghanistan, barring some sort of black swan event that nobody sees coming, right? Like nobody has thought for years and years that the Iranian regime would ever change from the hardcore theocratic sort of repressive regime that has been since the fall of the Shah. And yet we're on the precipice, perhaps, of a change in government in Iran, right? So there's always that possibility for something to make a change, and perhaps I'm over cynical, but I have a hard time imagining Afghanistan as a Germany or even a Vietnam. Greg,
Boy, so well said, Dave Seaver.
Yeah, I agree. I was just for background. I'm also an Afghanistan veteran. I did patient staging for air medical evacuation. I was there in 2010 when they did the surge. And I was in Qatar in 21 when they did Allies Refuge, and we got 58,000 refugees thrown in our lap. So yeah, I'm right there with you, brother. But yeah, I think you're right that, there are so many, there's the Pashto, the Dari, the Urdu, and then there's the little sub-tribes and groups and families and mafias, for lack of a better. I don't know that you could ever unite Afghanistan as a single entity country. There's just too much. Plus, there's the outside influence. You got stuff flowing in from Pakistan on the east, Iran on the west, all the other stands to the north. It's just there's so much going on there. It is just such a pot of stew that I don't know how you could ever get it all under control and unite it. I really don't.
yeah, they call it the graveyard of empires
Yeah.
for a reason. If Alexander the Great couldn't conquer it or bring
Right.
stability to it, the Brits couldn't at the height of their hegemony. Yeah, I don't think it was ever going to work with us.
Yeah, and I think for the everyday average Afghan, it's just a hard scrabble life and it's just survival from day to day. It really is.
Yeah.
They're just hoping they can find their next meal.
Well, and
Lot of
here's
them.
where the Taliban would eat our lunch on that, right, Dave? It's
Yeah.
a great point you're making. Is the Taliban was always willing to take the long view that this is
Right.
Afghanistan. Many have tried, whether the Greeks or the Brits or the Russians, all have failed.
Right.
Everyone is hard scrabble. They just want to make it from day to day. We just have to wait the Americans out. And what the Taliban and other groups like them really do well is they come in and they build their own schools. They build their own Islamic education centers called madrasas, and they do their own good works, right? One of the pillars of Islam is doing good works for the community. So these
Yeah.
groups do that, and they build community support, and they stay, and they're there, and they're part of the culture. And so one of a line that I stole that actually made it into the book that I stole from a CIA officer was he had a really, really nice tactical watch, and he would point to it and go, "We've got the watches, but they've got the time." Right.
Well, and that's the hallmark of irregular warfare is you have
Yep.
to be willing to wait it out and take the losses and wear down the morale of the other side. Classic case, Vietnam and now Afghanistan. And look where we wound up with both of those conflicts.
Yeah, and
With our
in
tail
fairness,
between our legs.
I think America as a culture, because of the great blessings we have with our wealth and our security, and most Americans aren't living the hard scrabble existence of an Afghan subsistence farmer, right?
Right.
We have, as a national culture, we no longer have an appetite for something that requires that much patience. We are very much a instant gratification sort of culture in many ways. Yeah.
I just want to, like, this is all, I mean, I love the conversation, and it's just tremendous. And I just wanted to share, because I know that my father worked for USAID for a long time. And so, and the inspiration for him to join was, in the aftermath of the Marshall Plan and all that success, and they created USAID. And there was a certain generosity in the sense of the United States was so wealthy and the disparities with other countries were so great. And the Marshall Plan had been so successful. Of course, that was a Western culture, so they didn't have the it didn't have that problems of just sort of history and understanding. But then he went to Thailand, where he was for a number of tours, and then he served 2 tours in Vietnam. And Thailand was a special case, but Vietnam was really problematic. But I do, before he passed away, I mean, the one thing when he was in Vietnam, he, they had USAID had a huge sort of presence there, and especially towards the end of the war. But when we went into Afghanistan, like that was a sense of, as you said, there was a morality to the response. And I certainly felt that, and everybody in New York felt that. I mean, it was very clear. But going into Iraq, that's what, they sent a lot of, they were trying to get USAID people over there. He didn't want to go, but I remember as that war and then the Iraq war went on, they seemed to have a lot of soldiers who were just, okay, build the well, build the school, as you were saying. And that's like that kind of from the ground up. But, they're not really trained in how to do that. It got to a point where it seemed like there were ground soldiers kind of trying to do this, what would have been in the Vietnam War, like a really USAID mission, where people are trained. And so everything kind of like fell apart or reincarnated into a process that you could just tell it wasn't going to work.
Well, you run into a real problem when you ask soldiers to do things that they're not specifically trained to do, and expect it to have the same impact as if you were, using trained people who specialize in that kind of work, right? If you want diplomacy, use a diplomat. If you want bad guys gotten, use a soldier. I think our civil affairs people, when I say they went out and dug a well, I should specify they actually went out and paid local Afghan contractors to build a well, right? Because we knew enough not to try to have soldiers dig wells. They don't know where the water table is. And it's better to put money back into the community if you can. And I think that's where, right. I think, again, not an expert, not a geopolitical person at all, but there are kind of 3 legs of US power. There's the direct kinetic military power. There's the power of diplomacy. And then there's USAID, which is what you were talking about, the power of support and assistance and generosity of American spirit. And I think those 3 things work very, very well together if they're used very well together. And if one of them goes away, you have a 2-legged stool instead of a 3-legged stool. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be.
I think if I could,
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Okay. So, I think I argued this a while back on here is that, in the 50s, 60s, we went into Afghanistan. We helped them build a lot of infrastructure.
Yeah.
You probably knew soldiers who took cover in irrigation canals that we helped them build so they could farm, etc. And it was a fairly functional country. They had a university in Kabul and, the cities and a government that was semi-functional. And then the Russians came in, and of course they, blew all that up.
Yep.
And, had we gone back in as soon as the Russians left and said, "Hey, what can we do for you? Can we help you rebuild this stuff?" I think history would have taken a whole different direction. But we didn't do that. We left that vacuum. The Taliban was able to come in and take control, and, that's where we are today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Dave. And I think, first of all, I completely agree that we should have done that. And I think wherever you see the US pull back, you see other people eager to take our place.
Yep.
So if you look at what the nation of China has been doing over the last 2 decades, with what they call their One Belt, One Road initiative of worldwide outreach and partnership with governments where we have pulled back, they come in behind. And that has led to an incredible extension of Chinese soft power around the world. I know that's not what we're here to talk about, right? But I think, when you're the strongest, wealthiest nation in the world and you're trying to promote stability and peace, like sometimes it's not a good idea to play. And hindsight's 2020, like you said, right? But yeah, that's a great point.
Well, and people don't realize when I was sitting in Bagram, I was 140 miles from China.
That's right.
They're on that eastern border there, and Afghanistan has a lot of natural resources that are totally unexploited, and they would love to be able to do that. So
That's right.
they're building that big road, right up through India, Pakistan, China, you name it. So they have big influence in the region.
Gretchen Ziegler, who's on this call, she was a Vietnam donut dolly. She stopped in Afghanistan for 2 weeks on her way home from Vietnam in 1967.
Wow.
Can you imagine what it must have been in 1967 to now? Totally fascinating. But I'm going to break in just to remind people, this is the Veterans Breakfast Club. We've been holding this conversation for 17 years. We started it in September 2008. It seems like one ongoing conversation about what serving in the armed forces is like, what the experience of war is like. And we capture it. I should say we engage these questions across the generations, across different experiences. Join us anytime you can, in person, online, every Monday night at 7 p.m., every Thursday night at 7 p.m. We do about 40 also in-person storytelling programs per year. We do travel. We publish a magazine. Our next program is going to be on Thursday. We're going to be talking with Joseph Balkowski, who is a historian. He's considered one of the greatest D-Day historians, but he's not going to talk about D-Day. He's going to talk about another book that he wrote called Beyond the Beaches, which is about the Normandy campaign after D-Day. We focus a lot on D-Day, as we should, but that bloody battle for Normandy took way longer than expected and caused way more casualties. So we're going to cover that, the 80th anniversary coming up here. We are in the 80th anniversary. Then on Monday night, we are on, I'm sorry. I can't share theirs.
That's because I'm sharing and showing everybody.
Man, I didn't even see that. Okay. So on Monday night, we're going to cover the 75th anniversary of the Korean War. I see Nars Khaliva is in the Zoom room. Nars is a Korean War veteran. I hope you come and join us on June 23rd, because on the 25th will be the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War. We're going to talk with Korean War veterans about that experience. And then finally, you don't have this, do you, Sean? Do you have this? Oh, that is our next magazine. It went to the printer today. Yay, Daria Summers pulled it together. Our expert managing editor, who just, absolutely has improved our magazine so dramatically in the past year. This is going to focus on the 80th anniversary of VJ Day. We're going to share stories that have been told at the Veterans Breakfast Club about VJ Day. and some other history there too. I just generated the list. We sent it out to 11,000 households. If you do not get it in the mails because we don't have your address, let us know your address. Would be happy to give it to you. And then finally, I want to acknowledge our wonderful sponsor for this program, which is UPMC for Life. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and options you'd like. They have Medicare plans designed for veterans, by veterans, and you could find out more at upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. That's upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. All right, back to you, Daria.
Well, I just thought, I know, Sean, you have do you have the photos uploaded?
I do. Give me 1 second. I'll
Okay.
bring them right up.
Because I thought that would be fun. Perhaps you can look at them and just tell us approximately where you were, Jeremy.
Yeah. So first of all, I find these photos heartbreaking because I had some hair. And even then, at the age of like, I don't know, 20 something, it was on its way out. And so I'm the tall guy on the left, if you can't tell. This would have been at the border crossing of Kandahar province and Pakistan. So this is just southeast of a town in Afghanistan called Spin Boldak. And we had my team leader on the counterintelligence team, a great guy named Jimmy Two Guns. And Jimmy Two Guns had an 8-can per day Diet Pepsi habit. And the only place we could find Diet Pepsi reliably, because again, we weren't on base, was in Pakistan. So every couple of weeks, we would take a ride out to Spin Boldak in the border, and we would meet with the local Afghan army and border guards, that we were partnering with. But then we would pop over the border to the bazaar there in Pakistan, like, jingle trucks there in the background. And we would pick up as many Diet Pepsis as we could for Jimmy Two Guns. And the guys on the team who smoked, they liked the Pakistani cigarettes better than what you could get in Afghanistan. And so they would get a bunch of Chinese and Pakistani cigarettes, and then we would head back to base. It was actually nice because it was, we were there principally in the summertime. So it'd be 110 degrees in the city, and it would smell like a rather underdeveloped city of 2 million people. And you get out here and it's, clear air and it's altitude. It's a little bit cooler. This would have been in downtown Kandahar. And that is me. Again, with the hair, look at it. It's glorious. And with a couple of my teammates and one of the folks that we met with on a regular basis, who was in the friendly Afghan government.
So that's an Afghan government official in the uniform?
That's correct.
Okay. All right.
Yep. And then this is another meeting. One of these is my SF partner, the other guy who's sort of kitted up there, and one of our interpreters, and then a guy that I actually helped bring to the U.S. After my tour. And what you see behind us there is Mullah Omar's personal armored Mercedes SUV, which was appropriated by U.S. forces, and it was one of the vehicles that we used to tool around in. And I called it Hopper because it had a real springy clutch. And if you hit it just right, you could actually get the front end bouncing like this. So if any of you are familiar with lowrider vehicles or the culture of lowrider classic cars and springy hydraulics. So if we were feeling a little bit froggy or we'd had ourselves a bit of a day and we were on our way back to base and I was driving, which I was only allowed to do a couple times because I did this too many times, because I would get that clutch going and we would start bouncing a little bit. And that is a Mercedes G-Class. So the U.S. retail market version of that is somewhere around $100,000. And that's not for the, the armored version that Mullah Omar had. This is my look how cool I am picture from that era. This is taken right outside Mullah Omar's compound. So again, I think I mentioned in the conversation, Kandahar, Afghanistan was the stronghold of the Taliban sort of quasi-government that was leading Afghanistan. And so Mullah Omar had a personal compound with an escape hatch and things like that. That was about 20 miles outside the city. And we would go out there from time to time because the U.S. took over the compound and maintained a small presence there where we engaged with the local populace. But this was one of the Russian military vehicles that the Taliban had captured and were using to guard Mullah Omar's compound. And it had taken a direct hit from some sort of aerial munition at some point and was abandoned there. And so, yeah, had my picture to kind of be like, look, Ma, here I am, sort of moment.
So I know we have someone has a question, but I just want to sort of transition this since we don't have much time left, because I think it's really important. You came back and you began to suffer from PTSD, and just a little bit about your journey and how sort of writing helped you. Like, I mean, not only heal, but like this is a great book.
Thank you. Yeah. Gosh, that was a huge part of the journey. So yeah, I came back from this tour. You know, some things happened while I was there. You know, had a mission go pretty badly sideways. Could have been a lot worse. Just kind of the environment where we were living in the middle of downtown Kandahar, the uncertainty, and we had a number of plots disrupted where we were targets for assassination and so forth. So I was dealing with what I came to discover was PTSD. And it manifested for me in, you know, anxiety, sleepless nights, waking in a cold sweat, right? Nightmares, but also anger, uncontrollable rage at like the smallest inconveniences. And I was really struggling with it. But at the same time, it was very early days in the war. And the US military had not sort of ramped up its sort of PTSD treatment and awareness, at least not where I was stationed. I remember going in for a medical checkup. And because I had been exposed to tuberculosis when I was there. So I was on some medication, and they asked how I was, you know, if I had any trouble sleeping, and I, you know, described what I was going through. And the Army doctor said to me, oh, you should maybe think about talking to someone about that. And that was sort of the most that anyone ever said about it. So I was kind of lost. And I had always loved stories. I had, you know, enjoyed in my younger years in high school writing. And I remember like reading a lot because reading let me kind of somewhat shut off my mind and just focus on the story. And I remember reading like a collection of short stories. And I think I read something by Stephen King, right? So it's never a good idea to read something by Stephen King and go, I think I could try that, right? Because like it's Stephen King. But somehow I decided I was going to try writing. And what I found was if I could write a story, I had the choice of taking some of my thoughts and feelings and emotions and like giving them to someone else in the story, putting them on a character, making that part of that character's experience. And in doing that, then that let me step back from those feelings a little bit and look at them almost like I was looking at them from the outside. And that let me somehow acknowledge what I was feeling and think about why I might be feeling that way, and put somebody in a story in a position where they could deal with what I was feeling. And I found that helped. And I spent a lot of years writing, mostly short stories. And I found that as long as I was writing, I was feeling better. Now, over time, the PTSD, you know, improved, and it's not something that I struggle with anymore. I'm thankful for that. But I think writing was a significant part in me overcoming that. And it became a habit. And I had written a novel and found a literary agent and kind of thought about, you know, trying my hand at writing novels. And then we when we pulled out of Afghanistan, I was like, whoa, all these thoughts and feelings are coming back. I want to write about this. Because I think I need a way to, again, sort of deal with these thoughts and feelings. And here's a way I know that works. And as Carol says in the chat, right, like there's healing in writing, journaling, things like that. And I wanted to write a crime thriller, and I wanted to set it in Maryland because I live in Maryland and I love Maryland. And I wanted to make it about Afghanistan in some way. And I wanted to make it about PTSD in a way. So that's where the Guilty Sleep came from. In my journey of PTSD from deployment to present was a sort of a journey of healing and dealing with my PTSD, and then ending up in this novel, which pulls a lot of my own personal experiences. The protagonist of the novel is a former Army counterintelligence agent who struggles with PTSD, so a little on the nose for me. And just a thumbnail sketch of the plot, if I may, is this is a former Army counterintelligence agent. Dovetails a lot with what we've talked about tonight, guys and gals, who is really struggling after returning home from Afghanistan, because Afghanistan, we've now pulled out, and Afghanistan is collapsing, and it's dredging up all these thoughts and feelings. And then his former teammates come to him and they say, remember this interpreter in Afghanistan who saved our lives when this mission went sideways. He's stuck, and we're trying to bring him to the States, but we're out of money. And our protagonist goes, well, look at the sad, sorry state that I'm in. I don't have any money. And they go, yeah, but you still work at the bank for your day job, don't you? And so he gets pulled into sort of a world of hurt under the auspices of trying to help his former interpreter. So that's kind of where the story drew from some of my own personal experiences, my own personal journey.
Well, that's great. I'll just say again, having read it, it's your expectations are constantly confounded. So it's a great it's a real thriller in that sense. So I don't know if we have time for one more question.
Yeah, Rich, you have your hand up.
Yeah.
One major piece that we're missing about the puzzles in Afghanistan is the religion Islam. And what we know is serious sectarian conflict. So Jeremy, can you address that just briefly? That's a factor, a huge enculturation factor that will keep, I think, that country divided. Just briefly. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Rich.
Near the end.
Yeah. And I am certainly no expert on Islam or its practices. But I think the nature of Afghanistan is very sectarian. We kind of talked about that a little bit before, the various cultures, tribes, ethnic groups, families, clans, and all of the relationships. And religion, just in general, is something that, humans have that lets them believe in something bigger and greater than they are. And it can be incredibly unifying and uplifting, and it can be incredibly divisive and violence stoking. And I think that's probably true across most religions, although again, I'm not an expert. But I think when you talk about the lack of cultural touch points and some of those challenges, I think that's definitely something that feeds into mindset. It feeds into thought process, and to your point, yeah.
Wonderful. Hey, and I just want to say, somebody just complimented you privately to me here, Jeremy, and said, boy, such a well-spoken, interesting person. And I wrote back saying, and he's a better writer than he is a speaker. So I would highly suggest you read some of Jeremy's writing. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeremy.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much to all of you for taking the time to join. And thanks to Todd, you and your team, for what you do with Veterans Breakfast Club. The more I read about it, the more I learn about it, the more I participate in it, the more I just absolutely love it. And what you're doing with and for this community is absolutely incredible. So just thrilled to be a small part of it.
And that's terrific, because I was going to ask you to come back sometime.
I'd love it. I'd be happy to.
And Daria, thank you again for bringing Jeremy to us and bringing this program to us.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, no, he's great. And I can't recommend his book enough, but and hopefully in the fall issue, you'll be able to read him, because we'll be publishing one of his essays.
great essay too. A great
So
essay.
thank you very much, Jeremy. This was great. Thank you, Sean and Todd and everyone. I thought it was a really, I mean, I learned a lot, great discussion. So thank you so much.
Yes, and I wanted to welcome Gary Glick back from Normandy. I know that you just got back to Normandy. I know that you have some stories to share with us, and I hope you'll all join us on Thursday night, 7 p.m. when we talk about Normandy, the battle after the warfare Normandy campaign after D-Day, and then Monday night when we turn to our Korean War veterans. And Nars, I hope I see you on Monday night. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good evening.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.